Welcome to Toasting the Classics podcast, where we take something that people call a classic and we talk about it and drink something inspired by the classic. My name's Dave McArthur. I've got some returning, actually not returning. I've got one returning guest host, and that is
That's Jay Schweig. I think we did To Catch a Thief. We did Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep with the worst drink ever, non-alcoholic beer.
That was bad. That was very
That
bad.
was really bad.
This will be, if this gets posted next, this would be like show 103, 104. So it's beyond what I can remember off the top of my head.
Awesome.
But we have a new guest host that's never been on the show before. Might have listened. That's always a bad idea. Do not bang on anything. Trust me, we made that mistake with the first show we did, and it's a disaster.
It's as bad as when you introduced me and I waved.
Hi. Yeah. Why was I picturing you waving like Forrest Gump?
That's my go-to wave.
Anyway, we have a guest host, a new one this week, an old friend of mine, and his name is
Steve Kattula.
And he is an expert in the subject that we will be discussing this week. Yep. As much as there is such a thing as an expert in a subject like this, what are we covering?
We are covering the first Van Halen album. So Van Halen 1, the introduction to Eddie Van Halen, who's known as a pretty good guitar player.
So Van Halen, the members of Van Halen went to the Led Zeppelin school of boring eponymous names for your albums, right? They're just Van Halen 1, Van Halen 2. But then they changed later, right? The later ones are like classy things like For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge. And,
Yes. Yeah.
What's the one with the baby? The one with the smoking baby on the cover? It's called. Okay, so yeah, equally uncreative as Van Halen.
Spelled out with the Roman numerals.
That was their series of Orwellian novels, novel-themed albums, I believe.
Right. I always thought that album was called Missive.
Yeah, I was going to say, they spell it out with the Roman numerals, right? Yeah. And I think you can even find on YouTube, you can find reveal the album celebration, New Year's Eve 1983, where David Lee Roth is really drunk and speaking in that kind of like Orwellian tone, you know.
Steve, I would say that is just proof that the algorithm has been working for you. I have never been suggested David Lee Roth drunk revealing an album cover of Van Halen on New Year's.
Wait, was that suggested to you, or did you look for it?
You
looked for it.
Maybe a little column A, a little column B.
Yeah, we had a little bit of a discussion about what would be an appropriate drink for this album, and what did we come up with and why. I actually don't remember the why. I know what it is. I have the drink, but I don't remember what the why was.
So we went back and forth between Schlitz Malt Liquor. That was like the beer of the band.
Which you guys sent me like a dope to the liquor store asking for Schlitz Malt Liquor, and they were like, "It hasn't existed since 1992. Are you a time traveler?" And I'm like, "No, I'm listening to this Van Halen album." Oh God, I am a time traveler. No,
right. In fact, if in the video for Panama, where they're all swinging on the rock climbing rigs across the stage, at one point,
I thought that was the video for Just Like Paradise, where they're rock climbing.
He did the rock climbing in that.
I have to admit, I'm baiting you. I do know that's just David Lee Roth. I do know.
Yes, thank you. Although interesting thing, the other thing I know something about, which is like building construction and design. We had a safety seminar about riggings for fall protection, and it talked about how they used to wear these belts, but then the rock climbers in the 1980s figured out this much better rig to basically not break your neck if you happen to like fall a few feet. So if you see like that Just Like Paradise video, or even I think the Panama video, they're in these rock climbing rigs swinging across the screen ahead of their time.
I thought that was a repurposed sex swing. Sorry. I don't know. Is that on 1984 Panama? Seems like it. Okay, good. I got it. Because I went through the track list for this one, which is Van Halen 1. I looked at the track list for Van Halen 2. I didn't recognize a single song. Should I? Is there something I should know on that album?
Two songs on Van Halen 2, Dance the Night Away. If you watch the movie,
that one, you know.
It's been in other movies before.
And Beautiful Girls. That's on there.
Beautiful Girls, Schlitz Gay. Saturday Night Live.
That commercial with Adam Sandler and Chris Farley, where it's like a beer commercial, but it subverts the norm and they're gay. Right? And they're like pool sitting. No. They're pool sitting and they open the Schlitz.
Whoa!
The Schlitz Gay. Yeah.
I mean, lots of good songs in there. I mean, anybody that knows the band. I mean, there's probably one of my favorite songs in there is "Light Up the Sky." They would open up their tours with that. But those are the two ones that like radio friendly, I would say.
I've never heard the song Spanish Fly. I'm going to guess that it's Eddie Van Halen playing very fast scales on a nylon string guitar.
You've heard it, right?
Okay. I have not heard it, but I'm going to guess that.
Why did you guess that? What's the connection there?
Because there has to be an instrumental and Spanish. Like, why would Spanish be in the title?
Yeah.
And so,
Right.
yeah.
I thought it was Spanish Fly because they were like hanging out with Bill Cosby and giving.
So I'll do a little segue here, and that is there are definitely a handful of songs that have kind of like Latin roots or Mexican roots in the Van Halen catalog. I mean, "Dance the Night Away" definitely has that feel to it with the rhythm. Jamie's Crying on the first album definitely does, but a lot, there's
I
chance
felt a little dumb when I realized that he's actually is Dutch.
Oh, the Van Halen brothers, yes. Well, they're
not as in like an American, like his family were immigrants from Holland 400 years ago, but like actually Dutch, and I think Indonesian.
Yes, their mother is Indonesian, their father's Dutch. I think when they came over on the boat, they were already little musical prodigies. Their dad was a jazz musician who had played.
Did they take a boat in the 60s?
Depending on how much money you have, or it was the 50s, I think. It was still like
I guess it would have been, because they started playing together in 1964, so if they must have been kids. They must be about the same age as like our dads, right? Like late 40s, probably. You know who's also Dutch and Indonesian from pop culture that like blew my mind when I realized it is Zach from Saved by the Bell.
Huh.
Really? Mark Paul Gosselaar.
Mark Paul Gosselaar, yeah. And when I heard that, I looked it up and I looked at a picture of him. I was like, oh, okay, yeah. You actually can totally see that he's like a little bit different than the average.
I think there was that Saved by the Bell episode where Zach leaves school to explore his Indonesian heritage and learns gamelan music.
The Dutch Indonesian is a funny thing because I think fans of the band can attest. For years and years, it was just Eddie Van Halen, his Dutch American rockers. Later in their careers, and I think that there were two videos I gave you guys, where one's with Eddie Van Halen at the Smithsonian, one's with Roth about 5 years ago. And they both, as they got into their old age, both of them would talk kind of at length about that mixed heritage. It was essentially the reason they left Holland, because after World War II, it was still Europe was still very much it was a white place, right? You had a culture there that it was not like it is now, and they were outcasts. There was a lot of racism there, and that's a big reason why they left Holland.
I guess what really struck me about the thing with Zach from Saved by the Bell is I was like, to me, as a white American, he represented white America to me as like the ideal blonde kid from California that I couldn't reach that ideal of whiteness, and yet
this is only very tenuously related, but I just saw a thing today where someone had taken a Saved by the Bell video of when Zach's band, I think you remember their name was the Zach Attack, was rehearsing in their garage and playing their song Friends Forever. And the guy was like, can Zach Morris really play guitar? So he took the guitar out of the track and he played exactly what Zach is playing on the guitar, assuming the standard tuning. And it sounds pretty bad. So I think he was not actually playing guitar. So we now have two Indonesian Dutch people.
Indonesian people
there goes that stereotype.
Yeah.
I thought all Dutch Indonesians were guitar virtuosos. But
what's good to kind of mention here is so they're born in the Netherlands after World War II. Their father, he was a lifelong jazz and big band clarinet and saxophonist. And I think it's really important to their sound and everything they did. As little kids, I think they were maybe ages 6 and 8 coming over on the boat. They were already, they had them playing piano and drums on the boat. The father brought his saxophone, clarinet. The kids are playing, for money on the boat coming over. They're already little musicians.
So I have like almost no connection with this music in general. Like I've heard some of the songs are on the.
Let me interrupt. We're supposed to be drinking, right? We don't do an official.
We are supposed to be drinking. Yes.
Okay.
Let's go ahead and do a toast. That's
toast.
Fine. Cheers, guys. Good talking to you.
Cheers.
Bottoms up.
Hope you're enjoying
your song on Van Halen too. Bottoms up.
Your Jack Daniel's whiskey. No, but what I was thinking as I was listening to it is, it was really clearly rooted in like blues and early rock music and R&B. Like you could hear like sort of the early influences of rock in that album in a way that you can in the early Beatles stuff too. They're doing covers of like older stuff, and it's shifted about 20 years.
Yeah, and Van
Yeah,
Halen obviously does a cover of the Kinks, which is sort of
Right.
is sort of like the last big shakeup in popular like
Which is
rock music,
absolutely
which is the
not a
British
band that-
invasion.
Yeah, definitely. It's one of the big shifts, but it's definitely not a band that needs to be covered though. Like I don't need to hear it. The Kinks are pretty much that's a good band. I don't need them to be touched. It's
Oh,
not
I would actually argue with that because I think they actually add something new to the cover. Like I think it just has a different feel to it.
Oh, it's a whole
and
new
Well, it definitely is using different instruments.
voice.
Yeah.
What I would even argue is that what Van Halen did, which is unique, was a number of things. Obviously, you have the guitar player, right? We can come back to that in a minute. Their whole musicality, their whole sound, so much of it is really harkening back to not just rock and roll, but the big band, jazz, and that whole thing, which was you're very proud of the performance. It's very dexterous, that kind of musical.
I'm gonna sound like an old guy, and I often do when I talk about these things, but you rarely ever, because of the way music is made today, because of the types of instruments you can use, performers just do not have the chops with instruments. Right. Like popular performers of music just do not have the musical chops that people. There's nothing like what Eddie Van Halen was doing.
Yeah,
I can't name a single person with a hit on the top 20.
I think it's very different now because I think it's so much about production. Right. And if you go to see a band, they're going to sound exactly like they did on the record because first they have a lot of backing tracks. And
well, except for auto-tune. Auto-tune, really, if you hear somebody like I saw The Weeknd live, I was like, he's terrible.
I mean, you can auto-tune live.
Yeah, okay.
So, I mean, but I think the thing is that so much of it is about production.
Mm-hmm.
I think you can tell from the record that they'd probably be pretty good live. Whereas older bands like The Who, I think actually The Who was even better live than recorded.
We actually did an episode about Kanye West, and I think he sort of represents what I'm talking about with the change, because I actually think he's a really gifted musician in the type of things that people do today. He's really good at putting together a really cool record and coming up with a bunch of interesting sounds, and he's very improvisational and things like that. But I don't think he can play any particular instrument to any virtuosic degree, and I don't think there's anybody like that anymore.
There are definitely people like that. They're just not. It's not where popular music is.
Exactly.
Right?
There's people all over
there's probably
YouTube
more
that can do very nimble things on many instruments.
Yeah, no,
but a lot of them are replicating what was done before.
Yeah, maybe.
I mean, so was Eddie Van Halen. I mean, Eddie Van Halen didn't invent tapping, right? I mean, he took it to kind of a new level.
Exactly. So I think there's a few things about Eddie Van Halen that I think that were said very well, and that is that with the tapping, it wasn't that he was the first person that did it, but he made it into an expressive language and really spoke it through a rock and roll vernacular.
I would also say, just talking about his guitar playing, I would say something that I found really interesting is there actually is a lot of melody in it, right? So Eddie Van Halen I think he kind of opened the door to these extremely fast players, which you hear on like various metal bands. Like there was a band called Nitro, and they have a song called Freight Train, which I really recommend you watch because it is just it's really just over the top. So at one point, their main guitarist does a solo, and the song, there's just nothing there in terms of melody or harmony in the song. I mean, it's just there's nothing there.
Whereas compare that to a song like "I'm the One." Okay, "I'm the One" is to me that's this.
Well, but let me just say. So the guitar solo for that, there's like an explosion, and then a four-necked guitar drops from the sky, and this he's like going, and he's doing tapping on all of them, and all four guitars sound the same, which always confused me because I'm like, can you just have one guitar? But there is no noticeable melody. It's just scales, just the fastest, like 64th note scales up and down the neck, maybe like 16 bars or something like that. Whereas with Eddie Van Halen solos on this album, there's a lot of melody in them. There's a lot of melody, like the guitar almost is another vocal line in a lot of the songs.
Yeah.
So I thought that's kind of an interesting amount of restraint. It's not just here's how fast I can play,
Yeah.
but it's actually adding something to the harmonic structure of the song.
I was reading the book by their producer of the album, and actually all their 6 albums they did with Roth, Ted Templeman. He talks about the first time he ever saw them at a club in Hollywood, and he was a jazz saxophone like player himself and everything, and appreciated that. And when he saw him, it wasn't that his jaw dropped and, oh, Eddie Van Halen, he's the next Hendrix. Oh, Eddie Van Halen, he's the next Jimmy Page. He said, oh my gosh, this is like seeing Charlie Parker. It's like seeing Dizzy Gillespie. The way that he's infusing melody with this effortless technical ability. You know, the producer falls in love with Eddie Van Halen. The band is great. They work well together. You know, he's the prodigy. I don't think anybody denies that. I'm the last person to ever say that.
Nobody would just. I kind of think it's kind of what Jay's getting at. Is nobody would really want to listen to somebody just shred on the guitar if there wasn't a good song and some kind of a personality behind the band and stuff like that. So I mean, I think like you said, there's probably thousands of people out there that can play like that today. It's probably easier to learn an instrument today with the internet and being able to watch videos and think. There's so many different ways to learn.
Oh yeah.
I guess what I'm saying is it's just not at the forefront of what people.
I mean, if you go to Nashville and you go in any bar, you will hear like the greatest guitarist you've ever heard in your life.
Sure.
I mean, it's just amazing how much talent is out there.
Yeah.
But it's about, I think what kind of sets the album apart is there's a lot of really good songwriting.
Yeah.
I don't want to say thought experiment because this is not like, epistemology or something, but it's kind of like a hypothetical. Imagine Eddie Van Halen couldn't do like the 2 hand tapping solos and stuff like that. But you had a song like Little Dreamer, but just without the solos. I think it would still be a good song. I think there's a good melody. There's a good progression. I think it would still have radio play. I don't think people are just like getting through it and waiting for, like, I had a coworker when I worked at the music store who loved
Ingve know who that is.
Yeah. And so, and he just loved these Ingve Malmsteen records. You could tell they do like 4-bar verse, 2-bar chorus, and then it's like 36 bars of just the fastest guitar playing you've ever heard. There's no song there.
But I do think when you listen to these songs, and like I said, I don't have a whole lot of experience. I listened to this album and I'm familiar with a few other songs, but it's Van Halen you're listening to. Like from the first bar of the first song, you're like, this is and I think that's what makes it distinctive is
Dave, it says that right on the album. I mean, you should know that. So, and
this is Van Halen too.
So the music really, there's so many different styles. It's an eclectic album. But going back to the producer, I was reading his book, and what caught me was they had the same sound engineer also work with them on these first 6 albums. So you have the producers here. He's hearing this like guitar prodigy. He knows what he wants to hear. They mix the album so that the guitar is a voice. It's not like an instrument. Like on a lot of rock records, it's loud, but there's methods to mix it so that the guitarist is speaking as like a full voice, almost like if you have 2 lead vocalists. The guitar is actually on one side. If you listen to it in stereo, it's on one side of the speaker, and then they push the vocals it's sort of centered, but it's sort of on the other. And so it's definitely a dichotomy. It's almost like a duet.
Well, like on the song, so I made a note about this one on Ain't Talking About Love, right?
Yes.
Who's playing the really distinctive riff, the one that is in my head after I listen to that song all the time? That like dun 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 dun.
Eddie Van Halen. There's only one guitarist.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if it was the bass or they have a rhythm guitar.
Or if you watched football for approximately 10 years after every time the New England Patriots scored a touchdown, they'd play that song. I mean, the number of sporting events that's been in is like.
Well, that one's got a really cool sound. That was one of my favorite ones on the album. I like that a lot. I think that was the one that kind of stuck in my. I just enjoyed that riff. That's a good one. I like.
Yeah, that's. Going back to the producer, he said definitively in his book that was his favorite song that he's ever produced. He worked with George Harrison, Hendrix, Van Halen, Doobie Brothers. You wouldn't think, I'll say what my favorite song is. He just puts it right in print.
I mean, probably Running with the Devil is the most popular one on this album, would you say? Is that the most?
I would say that's the most, in terms of radio play, that's probably
right. I guess that's what I'm going for. Yeah.
And that's
really got me. I think that appeared on a lot of commercials and stuff. I think
I've definitely heard it.
There was a Super Bowl commercial in the 90s where they had the Nissan cars, and it's like G.I. Joe and Barbie. So that was one. That was a big one where they used You Really Got Me.
So I don't remember how this song goes, but my note was that my least favorite song. Can you guys guess what my least favorite song on the album was?
Atomic Punk.
That's not. I don't. Nope. That's not what I put.
I was gonna say On Fire.
I don't even remember how this goes, but for Ice Cream Man, I just put in parentheses. Geez.
Oh, yeah.
Apparently, it was a real.
I don't know.
stinker.
That is a favorite of a lot of folks. I mean, that's had huge radio play. It's one of their most popular songs. I'd say,
Well, Dave, maybe you didn't fully understand. I believe it's an entendre.
Yeah.
Is it?
Yes, he's not literally dispensing
maybe
ice
that's what I
cream.
meant by
Yeah.
Geez. Maybe I didn't mean I hated it. Maybe
Did you listen,
something
Dave? Did you
scandalous
listen
going
to
on
it
in
all the
song.
way through?
I listened to the whole album 2 times as I walked around the city. Yeah, no,
Okay.
I listened to everything.
So you didn't just listen to like the flat.
But it was like
picking
2 months
guitar.
ago, so some of my memories have faded. But
on Ice Cream Man, the only part where Eddie Van Halen's not playing guitar is David Lee Roth does play acoustic flat pick guitar on Ice Cream Man until the rest of the band comes in.
I may have written G's because of the content of the lyrics. I'm actually looking at it right now. I'm trying to see, was there something dirty in it? Or
it's a cover. I mean, I would say the intent's not the lyrics, right? The intent is we're hearkening back to this John Brim blues tune from the 1930s. You have the Kinks tune, right, where it's like looking approximately 15 years back at the early phase of rock and roll. But so much of this album, whether it's Ice Cream Man or I'm the One, those two in particular, I'd say they're hearkening back to this earlier era of jazz and big band, and part of what makes it special.
I don't
Well,
know
I think
if
also
mentioned
there's with David Lee Roth, I feel like there's like a flamboyance, right? That I think
Charisma.
a lot of times. Well, I didn't say that. I mean like actually a flamboyance that I think the other band manages to keep in check. It's really kind of at its height during Ice Cream Man.
Yeah,
like Ice Cream Man is like just really kind of like almost like vaudeville or something like that. Whereas with the other ones, he's more in check. So here's another kind of hypothetical. Imagine you like didn't know anything about this band and this album just came out. I think just listening to it, you would predict that they would break up. Because I think there's actually a competition between the guitar. Yeah, there's definitely a competition, and I think that really works well on this album. But I could imagine in the future, I don't know what happens in kind of their other albums, if it's something like Pink Floyd, where Roger Waters pushed the other members out. But I could imagine there just being an imbalance.
Oh yeah.
So
but
there was an imbalance between Pete Townsend and Roger Daltrey. It seemed like, and there's some.
I don't think it's as bad. I mean, I think like it seemed like David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen like hated each other for a while.
You don't. There's no seeming. I mean, I think David Lee Roth in countless interviews has said, there was conflict right from the beginning.
Yeah.
But the songs that they came up with were the result of that conflict. They weren't the result of, they were getting along, and then all of a sudden in the studio, I'm going to get out my 12-string guitar and play some blues. And they're like, what? This was the conflict that existed all along, but it's also the conflict that resulted in the hard work that made the songs unique.
I think I saw an interview where, like, I think it was Eddie Van Halen. I think there were like still a band, and it was Eddie Van Halen and David Lee Roth. They asked them both a question, and it's a question like, what was your favorite city on the tour? And David Lee Roth is like, Shubidoo-wop, Timbuktu, climbing down from the Tower of Babel. And Eddie Van Halen is just like, he just looks like he has the world's biggest migraine. Like he just can't handle it. And it's like, I would almost say, I mean, not like everyone should be diagnosed with something. I would not be surprised if David Lee Roth had like, if he were a kid today, if he'd be diagnosed with something like ADHD or something like that.
Yeah,
because he really kind of just...
There's countless
personality
interviews on YouTube, whether it's the one Mark Moran or there's a couple Joe Rogan. What he says about himself is that he's hyperactive, but he can concentrate. I wouldn't say he's all over the place. He has definitely, especially in interviews, which I don't know how related that is to the music that he writes, melodies and lyrics, but he has a whole stream of consciousness routine.
What about this suggestion? Drugs, maybe? Were there drugs involved in this band?
Sure.
Oh, we're already having alcohol. I feel like that would be too far.
No, thank you.
It's 1978.
But like I read Geddy Lee's biography that came out recently, and I was shocked at how many drugs they were doing. I mean, they were just doing a ton of drugs. I'm like, you can't really hear it in like their interviews. It's not like David Lee Roth would be like a perfectly subdued kind of mild-mannered person and then he'd take some kind of drug in it.
Well, also, wouldn't you think that Rush, their drug use would have been like scheduled to certain times of day and then they have plenty of time?
Yeah, you would think so.
everything that comes out in the vocals, where you have the breakdowns in the songs and the talking and the charisma. Admittedly, David Lee Roth is not the most skilled vocalist in the classic sense. Going back to jazz and stuff, he was a saxophone player. The father was saxophone and clarinet player. David Lee Roth was a saxophone player. Their father would go with them on the tour bus because he was a traveling musician his whole life, right? So then his sons become traveling musicians. He's like, I'm just going to roll with you guys on the tour bus. He and Roth became friends. So there's a camaraderie there. That all comes across, I think, in the music. He would throw his voice rather than like sing classically. He would throw his voice in this kind of multi-pitched wheezy rasp, right? Which is that kind of dual tone, just like almost like a clarinet reed or a saxophone reed has, right? He's got, what I would say about David Lee Roth and what people don't count on a lot is that even though he wasn't as skilled as Eddie Van Halen, who's like a musical savant, he also had a musicality. He had a very heavy knowledge of music, and all the musicians he's worked with over the years have said that, and that enabled him to transpose and translate and write melodies.
There's a lot of voices in rock, right? Like lead man, like, face of the band, like, good voice for the band. But I can't really think of anybody off the top of my head that I would credit with being like a master of his instrument in terms of his vocals. There's guys who have good voices and who can sing. Mm-hmm. But I think we'd be really blowing out of proportion if we said like someone like Axl Rose is like a master of the voice. Like he has a good voice. Like
I'll contrast it with the lead singer of Boston, right? So Boston was a band that came around the same time. I get
Boston
right?
mixed up with Journey, I think.
They're similar, but
which is the song? There's a song by Journey and a song by Boston. I can never remember which one is which.
More Than a Feeling. More Than a
Feeling. Is that
okay? That's Boston. The guitarist there writes the songs, transposes the songs. He basically came out with the songs, wrote the lyrics, everything. Here it is. And then the vocalist shows up, and that vocalist had a very, I would say, he could have gone to a Broadway show and sang in a Broadway production. But he was basically there because of the voice. Roth was there because of the creativity, the charisma. He's writing half the song.
I went to a talent show that my son was in, and there was a girl who was older than him. She's like, I don't know, 16 or 17. And she got up and she did like a Broadway song, and she hit like a high C. And I watched the way she sang. And, I'm very close, like hearing somebody sing like that. And I'm like, nobody in rock music has this kind of training and ability. This is phenomenal. What this girl is doing with her voice is like a thing of beauty, like watching somebody play.
I don't know. There's some like the glam metal people who like a lot of times they were like classically trained vocalists and stuff. I don't know if it translates super well. Like, you don't want
I guess I'm talking about the people we hear on the radio, the big ones. If you said, "Oh, who's got the best voice in rock?" It'd be a bunch of guys with good voices who are not like that.
But like someone like Sia has an incredible voice.
Yeah,
she does, but she's always straining so much. It bothers my ears to hear. I feel like she's gonna damage herself. There's this song that she has. I can't remember what it's called, but you can hear something's about to break. She has a great voice, but I mean,
it could be something that she's actually like looking for, right? That's kind of like an aesthetic.
I was just thinking that. Yeah, exactly.
Right. But if you were to take even kind of a demanding song, or like Whitney Houston is a great example. Like Whitney Houston had an incredible voice.
Right.
But if you were to take a pop song and sing it in an operatic or a Broadway style, it would sound absolutely ridiculous.
What's the song about, and what's the sound about, and what are they aiming at, right? Everybody from Les Paul to Frank Zappa, they credit Eddie Van Halen and this Van Halen sound with transforming the instrument, right? Frank Zappa said he reinvented the electric guitar. The personality, I would say, and the tone is really dripping off the album.
That's what I was trying to say, is to my untrained ear, from the first song on this album, I was like, there's nothing like that before. It sounds different than everything before it. I can't even really give you a good technical explanation for why, but to my untrained ear, I'm like, that's Van Halen, that's different than what came before. Like,
I can give you a little bit of a technical explanation for why. One first is that you have somebody that, I mean, he wasn't as complex as like Beethoven or somebody, right? But Eddie Van Halen, obviously, he was born a little different. He's born hearing his dad, the jazz musician, play all the time, right? Like, he's surrounded by music, but he literally, with a kid with not much money, he's ripping apart guitars. He's going to the hardware store because he hears tone sounds in his head that he can't get with the amps that he has.
Yeah.
He's like electrocuting himself. he finally finds this is like, documented very well, and he's talked about it in interviews. He finds a European voltage variator called a variac, so that he can change the voltage variation. This is when he's like 19 years old, 18 years old, and then putting different guitar parts in, creating his own guitars, because he hears a certain tone and sound he wants to chase.
It may be the case. He may be a better musician in terms of his instrument than Beethoven was.
Yeah.
Beethoven's a composer, right? I mean, that's the difference. I assume he was a good piano player, but I don't think that's what he was famous for. Mozart, I think, had his chops on the instruments he was famous for. Some of them are, but
it was a different time. I mean, this was the late 70s in California. To get girls, you play guitar. So how am I going to maximize getting girls playing the guitar? There's some of that too, right? It's
when you describe him going to the hardware store and stuff like that, and the whatever the technical term, the electronic part. That's not somebody that's thinking about girls. That's someone who's obsessed with his instrument. You're doing that for love.
I would say, I mean, I'm looking through kind of So this album came out in 1978, and I think, I mean, you can see kind of like similar things like Ted Nugent, Aerosmith. They had similar guitar sounds. It wasn't as kind of focused on the high end, and it definitely wasn't as compressed. I mean, his sound has a ton of compression, which kind of does give it that kind of vocal.
What do you mean by the actual like timbre of the music has more compression? Or you mean the way or what he's playing?
Yeah, just the effect compression. So compression, what compression does is it makes so if you imagine like sounds versus amplitudes, right? You have all these different amplitudes. Compression kind of makes them more equal, and that's why like guitarists will play solos using varying amounts of compression, because naturally if you have a guitar and you're playing a high note, just physically, it's not going to sound as loud as a low note, because a low note is, right, it's a bigger string, it's more mass vibrating. And so compression makes kind of, and if you imagine like what rock solos sound like, you can hear not only the notes, but you hear like little glitches in between the notes. If you imagine like a Pink Floyd solo, like David Gilmour uses a ton of compression as well. If you imagine a Pink Floyd solo, you even hear like his fingers kind of slipping on the strings. Like there's like that. Yeah. And that's from tons of compression, right? You would not hear that so much on like an acoustic guitar or something.
So there's this tone that he's chasing, right? And I think that's expressed in what he does with the tapping, right? Because he's trying to hear those harmonics and express them better. So he's trying to get this kind of multiphonic, almost. I mean, obviously I'm the last person to compare like guitar to saxophone, right? Jimi Hendrix used to compare the guitar sound to woodwind instruments too. But I think he's really going about it. Maybe it's something to do with his dad and hearing that sound, but also there's the percussive nature. Didn't talk about it, but as a kid, he's coming to California. His mom, she was Indonesian, very academic. Literal, it's like almost a definition of like a tiger mom, has them taking piano lessons. So as a kid, from I think it's the age of like 8 to 13, he wins like the Eddie Van Halen won the Southern California like piano concerto competition. So you're dealing with this like kind of different level of musician on so many levels.
Yeah, I think we talked about this maybe during the Beach Boys album, but people think of Southern California as being this like cultural desert, but it's really not. A lot of output coming from a place like that. There's a lot of affluence,
output, and there's a lot of diversity.
There's a lot of diversity. There's a lot of exposure to like to markets and things like that for whatever music you're doing. There's just a lot going on in a place like that.
If you think about it, it's one of the first places in the world, right? Southern California, where you had immigrants from Southeast Asia, from South America. You had people coming from all over the rest of America, like Midwesterners, Easterners, African American as well. A lot of places, even in the United States, you might have had immigration like the Southern African Americans moving to Detroit or whatever. But this complete amount of different neighborhoods in one place was very unique in the world.
The place we grew up is a little bit like that. It's like a microcosm of someplace like LA. Pretty diverse, and
only without the culture. So
it's
other places, like Northern Virginia would kind of approach that later on, but this was like this 1960.
Very early. I mean, it's really the first great big huge suburbia. I don't know. I was going to bring this up before when we were talking about the sort of blues and R&B influence on rock and roll. I had this interesting fact, and I don't remember if I brought this up on a podcast episode before, but do you guys know what the last #1 rock and roll song was, like on Billboard in the United States?
Oh gosh, was it
and what year? And what year it would have been?
What's that band from Canada that no one likes? But that's certainly some amount of people secretly like.
Let's just say that's not a bad guess. Because the last #1 rock and roll song in the United States of America was "This Is How You Remind Me" by Nickelback.
Right.
Oh, wow.
It has been almost 25 years since the last rock and roll song to go #1 in America.
Yeah.
And that I don't remember who said this, but I read somewhere that this guy said that rock and roll music lost its popularity and sort of lost the spirit of America when it got far away from its R&B roots. When you stop being able to hear that backbeat in the song, it turned into kind of this emo thing, and it just, it was popular for a little bit. And honestly, as much as I liked the music when I was a kid, things like Pearl Jam that just don't have a beat, there's no.
Well, I think Pearl Jam was very popular, but I think unfortunately the Eddie Vedder kind of vocal style was very easily imitated, and so it led to kind of new metal and bands like Nickelback, like Creed,
Matchbox
bands
20.
and it just
exactly. Yeah. I think that carried on for a while because it was a popular genre at the time with people our age. And I remember myself around 1998, 99, I started saying like, oh, there's really not a lot of good music out there. There was a little bit of a pulse in the early 2000s with some bands like The Strokes that I really liked, and The Killers. I really enjoyed that, but it all that never got to #1. None of those songs in that wave reached that.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I think going back to this album, and like you talk about beat and the percussiveness and everything, didn't talk a lot about Alex Van Halen, Eddie's brother, who, by the way, he's coming out with his autobiography entitled Brothers in a few weeks. And very, very interesting. Not just about him. It's, about him and his deceased brother. Obviously, they're coming through in that kind of stereotypical way. It's the Sunset Strip. They're rockers. They're working their way up the Sunset Strip to be the best rock band on the scene, right? But on the side, they're brothers. When their dad was like, we don't have a guitar player and a drummer for my jazz gig at the Smoke Club tonight on the other side of town, they would routinely go do that. So to make a buck. So
they put in just like the Beatles. It sounds like they put in their 10,000 hours, right? They just worked. They worked absolutely. And they played. And
David Lee Roth always uses that term, 10,000 hours. Alex Van Halen, is he as technically adept as Neil Peart? No, he's very technically adept, right? But what does he have? He has that swing. He has that jazz sound. He's hitting the hi-hats, the cymbals and everything. He's purposefully playing behind or before the beat a little bit, like the old school, big band jazz style. Very different than like something like Def Leppard, where you have the echo on the drum and it's like downbeat, very syncopated. And I love Def Leppard, but it's different. It's way different.
Do you really love Def Leppard though?
I like them. Yeah.
All right.
Coming back to your favorite topic, Mark Paul Gosselaar from Saved by the Bell.
Good.
So as kind of another thought experiment, say you had like the greatest actor in the world, but playing a part in Saved by the Bell, would you be able to tell they're the greatest actor in the world?
Sometimes I wonder that about Keanu Reeves. I'm like, is this guy amazing? And he just keeps getting
he was never in Saved by the Bell. But sorry to be a trivia.
But he was in Bill and Ted.
But the reason I bring it up is that a drummer like Alex Van Halen, he's drumming what's right for that band. And in the same way, like you can't, even if Ringo could drum like Neil Peart, he's not going to do it in the Beatles. Right. It's not going to make sense.
It would be obnoxious if he did.
Yeah. It would be extremely obnoxious.
It's kind of, that reminds me of like, I remember thinking about, I don't know a lot about the drums, but I do know that the guy in The Police is a really good drummer.
Stuart Copeland,
It's like the things, the little improvisations and flares he's doing are just on the edge of maybe they'd be annoying if he was doing more. It doesn't get in the way of the song at all, but you can hear there's a really good drummer.
And it's funny, The Police and Van Halen were like almost the exact same timeline. I mean, they're different drummers, but I would put Stuart Copeland and Alex Van Halen in like kind of parallel categories. Each had their very, very distinct sounds.
Very different sound, yeah. I saw an analysis of 20th century music, and it showed that there. I don't even know how they did this. It was through computers or AI or something, and it showed that there are these two big shifts in 20th century music, or at least in the second half of the 20th century. And I think the first one was the Beatles, but the second one was the Police. That like what they did was so different from what other people were doing in rock music. Not like really in general music. Like they weren't doing anything nobody'd ever done before.
Yeah.
They were doing something in rock that was very different. I think it was
And
basically
that big innovation, Sting's fake Jamaican accent.
Yes.
Yes.
No band is doing the fake. So basically
Walking
Sting
on the moon.
Sting walked so Shaggy could run, I guess one might say.
Right.
An interesting thing. Sorry, I'm getting ice for my drink here. Probably not the greatest thing for a podcast.
Make sure you shake it really close to the mic while you're doing it. That's
of course,
that's good radio.
An interesting thing that I was going to mention is, in a way, a lot of things about the album are kind of like historical artifacts. So you mentioned the last rock song to be in #1 was a Nickelback song, but I don't think any Nickelback songs have guitar solos on them.
No.
And then you mentioned Pearl Jam, but Pearl Jam songs do have guitar solos. I think that's kind of the last, like early Pearl Jam, I think is the last kind of bastion of this idea of like every song that rocks has a guitar solo.
It's a really interesting observation. I'm not ready to sign off on it. I'd actually want to like check and see whether like the Killers have a guitar solo or something. I really don't know.
Right.
There's one in Last Night by the Strokes. There's a long.
Is a bridge a solo, right? Like
it's more of a bridge. It's not anything fancy.
Well, the Strokes brought them back because they're trying to do kind of guitar rock, or garage rock revival, right? Like 70s kind of garage rock revival.
Well, okay, like listen to a song like "Sing, Sing, Sing," right, which is Benny Goodman. Jay, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I was kind of thinking things a little more contemporary, but go ahead.
But hear me out. But on one end of the spectrum, if you think about it, that song is a bunch of solos, right? It's like drum solo after sax solo. That was the way it was like a competition. It was like the way they did things then. Whereas, is music, there's so much else in the culture now that like, are people inspired now to be like, I'm going to be the best clarinet player in town? Does that exist?
No, there'd be the guy who says, I want to get the most likes of any clarinet player on YouTube. That would be what.
Mathematically, there has to be a best clarinet player in town. There's the set of clarinet players that's finite, so there's one that's best. No, but actually, I think there's an interesting thing happening, which is just the character and the tone of popular music. Is there's a uniformity that comes from everything being digitally processed, and what a guitar solo does is it says, this instrument is kind of standing out against everything else and kind of having its moment like in the spotlight. And I don't think that kind of is in character with how like music is just so uniform. Like if you listen to a pop song, like say like you mentioned Dua Lipa, you listen to a Dua Lipa song, try to actually pick out synthesizer, guitar, bass, because they're in there, but they're so blended together that it's like one of those like it's like a 2008 mortgage-backed securities where all the mortgages were like linked together, right? And you can't extract like one thing from another.
Dua Lipa market's going to crash. We got to be careful.
Yeah. Well, that was my goal for tonight, is to link Dua Lipa's music with the 2008 mortgage-backed security instruments. So it's a trite comparison, I know.
We haven't mentioned the whole Sammy Hagar thing yet at all. I thought we might talk about that.
I thought we would. Did we want to talk about Van Halen 1, right? Which is like this transformative.
True, we can keep coming back. That's right.
And that's kind of what I was thinking, right? It's like I don't want to get too lost. Although I'll add this, okay? Repeating myself a little bit, but what David Lee Roth brought to the group as a vocalist and is expressed on this first album is this very, I think, diverse background, this music. I think, honestly, a musicality, even if he doesn't have the technical chops of some other singers, it's very interesting, right? And these melodies that he's working with the guitar, they kind of work in contrast to it, like you were saying, then Jay, which is a little unique in that a lot of times a vocalist will kind of sing on top of it, whereas he's almost like competing with the guitar. It's a little different. The Sammy Hagar albums, I love some of those songs, but it's more like a sonic sound. It's like you have Sammy Hagar is a high tenor. He's coming in with this this broad voice on top of very standard hard rock, whereas this is like very unique hard rock.
One of the reasons I wanted to mention the Sammy Hagar situation is that he was part of what I read on, I think it was on Wikipedia, but it was the douchiest sentence I've ever read in my life.
no.
It said Sammy Hagar and David Lee Roth were introduced by their mutual Ferrari mechanic.
Well, that would be Eddie Van Halen and Sammy Hagar.
Right.
After David Lee Roth quit the group. That's
did I say David Lee Roth? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, you're right.
That's not as bad as the Strokes meeting at an elite private boarding school in Switzerland. that's still not as bad as that.
Not all of them, but yes.
Yeah, this was after they, they all grew up poor, and then after they made it rich, then they brought the new singer, and then they met the new singer after they were.
It's different because they're active rock stars, right?
It's a whole different thing. And
but while I'm on the subject of great sentences I read while doing this research, there was also one talking about, let's see if you guys can guess who this is referring to. A loquacious, worldly, energetic son of an ophthalmologist.
Is that Kofi Annan, former Secretary General of the United Nations? Okay.
When I was reading that sentence, I couldn't help thinking, like, you scruffy, stuck-up, half-witted nerve herder.
Son of an ophthalmologist. Yeah. Like someone cuts you off in traffic. Son of an ophthalmologist. There's almost kind of an unclassifiable thing in music that is like the motion of a piece. In other words, even if you like, a particular chord or something like that, if you just play the chord, it goes nowhere. It's not a song, right? Mm-hmm. So let's take, because you were talking about Sammy Hagar, let's take his magnum opus, I Can't Drive 55. If you take Sammy Hagar's vocals out of I Can't Drive 55, it'll basically just sound like clearly a backing band. Like that wouldn't be a song to listen to.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's probably not true of a lot of the songs on this album.
No.
Like the thing that harmonically I find the most interesting is Little Dreamer. I just kind of like the progression of it. I think if you were to completely remove David Lee Roth's vocals, there's enough guitar melody and there's enough harmonic motion that it might not be a song that you would listen to every day, but it's like it's interesting enough and there's enough motion to kind of keep you interested rather than it just being like a karaoke backing track or something like that. I think that's one thing that's very different about that.
I guess that's what I was saying about Stuart Copeland's drumming. Is there something interesting to the way he's doing it? It fits the song. Yeah. It's part of the song. He's not like doing flourishes that are taking your attention away. But you can
like Walking on the Moon, if you took Sting's fake Jamaican vocals out of it and you just listened to that very simple progression, but there's enough kind of interesting stuff that I think would still be interesting to listen to. It wouldn't just sound like a backing track.
That is one benefit of like AI and everything now. There's a whole bunch of great music that people have put through AI processors, and you can remove vocals in a good way, right? Not so like the sound goes low all the time, low and high, but you can remove that. And there's a fair amount on YouTube that I've listened to of Van Halen, and it's super interesting. You hear things like with the drums, or if you have two guitar tracks that you just didn't hear with the vocals on it. And it's like, I love both. And when I'm at work, I exclusively listen to instrumentals if I'm trying to concentrate. And I can actually listen to rock music instrumentals, but I can't, if there's any vocals, like I can't.
No words.
Yeah. You know what's good for that? There's actually from Cape Verde, there's like a bunch of psychedelic music and like very interesting like stuff. And since I don't speak the language, it's actually perfect because there's vocals, but it's not distracting you because you don't know what they're saying.
Yeah. I had some African music, like languages. I mean, like Cape Verde, unfortunately I would know a couple of words of Portuguese, right? This sounds like Spanish. So I feel like you might, but like I tried that. I was like, I'll listen to something in Congolese or something. And my brain is trying to understand the words. It's distracting, even though I have no chance of knowing what they're talking about. I can't do any words.
No, there's a song off. It's not off the first album, but off of Van Halen 2 called "Out of Love Again," and that one is like Eddie Van Halen loved Alan Holdsworth, and that one is like a jazz. If you take the vocals out, it's like, oh, this is like some jazz fusion guitarist. Like it's almost not even hard rock. Like it's loud. The tone is compressed.
That was like Steve Vai's favorite guitarist. That was like his idol growing up. Alan Holdsworth.
That's Eddie Van Halen's favorite guitarist. He said it many times. It's Alan Holdsworth. Eddie Van Halen tried to get Alan Holdsworth a contract with Warner Brothers in the late 80s. And he got him a record, but then it didn't sell because it's like, it's complex, avant-garde jazz fusion stuff that the average person isn't like listening to,
That's nice.
That's
to throw
weird
your
because
car around,
avant-garde jazz fusion is usually such a cash cow for the record industry. So it's the
That's
one time it doesn't pan out.
I want to throw out one more thing.
Okay.
It's not on the first album, but it was on their fifth album, Diver Down. I've talked a lot about big band, jazz, swing, this background in Van Halen, because I think everybody said everything, but I just want to kind of push that, right? Like I think it's like an understated influence on the band. Their father was still alive at the time, and so you have this hard rock band at the peak of their time. And David Lee Roth says to Eddie Van Halen, let's get your old man to play on a jazz tune on our frickin' record. And so they did it. They have a song it's a cover song called Big Bad Bill. And so you have the drummer with the brushes, harkening back to playing with his dad in the clubs. You have the bass player who also he played in jazz bands in high school. And then David Lee Roth doing this is baritone, like that, like Louis Armstrong. And Eddie Van Halen's also doing the umpteen chord changes that are in like a song of that era. It doesn't sound like a band that's struggling. It sounds like a band that effortlessly just went in the studio and just did this. And I think it speaks to the difference of that band, the musicality. Like I enjoy it. I don't pass by it on there. It's one of the more unique, interesting things about the band. And even though it's not on this first album, it's worth a listen.
I would say there's another thing about the album that kind of surprised me. So it's definitely not the kind of album I listen to these days. I listen to stuff that isn't as guitar heavy and stuff. But something about the album is so you mentioned Boston earlier, and if you listen to like a song like Don't Look Back.
Oh yeah, Don't Look Back.
Yeah. The reason I bring it up is if you listen to that song, which I never intentionally listened to that song, but it was on the radio just all the time. If you listen to that song, it just really, which I think it was how it was made, it really sounds like they just made track after track after track, and probably sometimes took the 30th take or the 40th take or something. It's just so meticulous, and I think it just robs it of any kind of capriciousness of rock and roll, right? You have
spontaneity.
Yeah, spontaneity. You don't have any feeling.
Feel free to shoot me down if I'm saying this completely out of turn, because it's not a band I ever really listened to, but I think that's why the sound of Rush never appealed to me. Like I heard it on the radio and it just...
Rush is not supposed to be like a just crazy,
right.
That's why it was so surprising when there was so much drug use in Geddy Lee's autobiography,
right.
Because it's supposed to be a more measured thing. Like in the same way, like if you were reading Itzhak Perlman's biography and he's talking about all this drug use, you'd be like, what? But if you're reading like Aerosmith, you're not going to be surprised, right? They're two completely very different approaches to music. And so something like that Boston song, it's just it's so obvious that it was just engineered. They were never even in the same room playing it and just kind of put together. Whereas this album, it really seems effortless. Like I'm sure they recorded because you have to record things separately. You could imagine them just going into a room and playing each of these songs, and then the only part that it's obviously not done live are David Lee Roth's overdub vocals.
I think it's kind of what you're talking about. I think about this a lot as a band gets older. You hear these later songs in a band's career and it sounds kind of, they just showed up and they all did their part. They wrote some sentence and that was going to be the hook for the song, and then they just kind of get to the chorus and then they do
or they get more self-conscious.
I wonder whether it's the aging brain just doesn't have the creativity, or whether it's because you're so busy. You just don't have time to really write. You've got money. You're not really hungry anymore. I always wonder what's the phenomenon that's going on there. Like I think about that a lot. Like, you listen to later U2 and you're like, this is not the same band as what was going on.
Now Bono has 3-4 kids. They have to be dropped off at school at a certain time. Right. Life gets in the way. Think back when we were living together, right? And Jay, you were honorary living with us.
Yeah, I think
what was our we took
he's the George Best of
to set up this podcast.
Pete Best.
Sorry, George Best is a soccer player.
How many texts to set up this podcast because of life? Whereas if it were Random House, it would have been like, it's Friday night. You want to do a podcast? Yeah, let's just do it.
Yeah, but let's play Drinking Goldeneye first.
Yeah, we'll do that first because we have.
I think it would have been like. I think it would have been like, let's play Drinking Goldeneye first. Also, what the hell is a podcast?
Yeah, exactly. I'm not sure the word existed at that point. I think it was invented earlier than you think, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
probably around 2003 or something like that when that was invented, 2002. So not
Well,
that long.
I think the idea had been around for a while, but it was only with, speaking of like, the video game system and memory when
Mhm.
things had enough memory to carry them, right? Because like even the early iPods couldn't carry, a bunch of 2 hour recordings.
Well, I
There just
mean, think
wasn't the
about how
memory in
long it
them.
would have taken to download a podcast episode in 1998.
I can't believe I LimeWired all those podcasts
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
in
exactly,
college.
exactly.
It was not worth it.
I remember I was trying to watch the trailer for Phantom Menace on the on whatever internet speed we had at Random House.
Yeah.
And I was like I would
72K.
check back 20 minutes later and I'd have 3 more seconds of the trailer and I'd watch that and then go do something else. I mean, it took hours and hours to download this minute and a half long.
Yeah, I had to LimeWire all those This American Life episodes. Sometimes they wouldn't be that good, and I would be like, "Well, that's 7
Oh,
days
Ira
of
Glass, you bastard.
Yeah, Dave, I remember you coming downstairs looking distraught one time, and you're like, I think the Star Wars movie is just about this anteater guy who talks in a Jamaican accent.
This is definitely getting cut because you don't want to get me started on Phantom Menace, but I
Well, as long as we're
I
saying things
distinctly-
that get cut, I think someone should take AI and make Jar Jar sing the police songs with the fake Jamaican accent. I think it's
Wow.
the perfect marriage
That would be.
of horrible Jamaican accents.
No, I remember
with,
we all got together at
Oh.
Joe Urban's dorm, and we
Uh-huh.
all got together there in this big room and watched the trailer when it first came on TV on a big screen. And my first thought was just like, I think that's going to suck. But then I convinced myself it wasn't going to suck. And then literally the second I sat down in the movie theater that first night, I was like, I'm leaving. This is terrible. Like you could just tell right away how terrible.
I moved at any segment of the podcast that begins. We all got together at Joe Urban's dorm. Be automatically
Instantly
cut.
By the way, speaking of the police, unpopular opinion.
Are they coming to the shed? Are they headed towards the shed?
They're not headed towards the murder shed. But and Jar Jar Binks,
Hey, yay, oh, come out with your hands up.
in the Van Halen, right? This was going back. You have this conflict, right? And that brought out some great music, right? That brought out some very interesting back and forth. But how long can that go on till people are you just get exhausted?
I mean, I think
and so that happened in Van Halen. That happened in the Police.
I think Morrissey and Johnny Marr is very comparable.
Oh,
I
yeah.
think those guys couldn't stand each other on some level from the beginning, although they were a lot more collaborative than what I'm hearing from Roth and Van Halen. I don't think the hatred was quite as intense, but
I think it was the same kind of collaboration. I think both guitarists were really good at writing the music, and I think they didn't really collaborate in terms of writing the vocal lines. I think the vocalist wrote the vocal lines and the lyrics in both cases.
But there was something better from the two of them being together.
Collaboration is hard. I just think about how much better this podcast would be if it were just me. It would be so much better.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you could certainly pursue your own direction.
I'm going solo. I'm going to get Steve Vai and Greg Bissonette and Billy Sheehan, and we're going to start a band.
Oh, so that's who I was trying to remember who Steve Vai was the guitarist for solo David Lee Roth, right? Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah,
but also a really well-known guitarist in other.
Oh yeah.
I've heard it, but that's why I heard it.
And I think, I'm going to speak one more time. I'm going to give him a shout out because I think a lot of times everybody be like, oh, David Lee Roth, charisma, but musical buffoon. He's writing these melodies that everybody loves and everybody sings along with, that they play at the ball games. After Van Halen, he doesn't just get anybody. He gets like Steve Vai. He gets like the expert bass player.
That sounds like charisma, though, right?
Well, there's charisma, but he's interested in musicality. Even if he isn't the most technical himself as a vocalist, his expressiveness, he wants to express something that's very musical. His drummer, Greg Bissonette, ended up being his drummer for many years, but then also the drummer for Ringo Starr for like the last 20 years.
I was having a conversation with someone the other day that they were sort of poo-pooing like a pop music band. I can't remember who it was. Mm-hmm. And I was saying, like, I get it. I get what you're saying. It's pop music is simpler, right? Mm-hmm. I think I was thinking of actually Chapel Roan, and I was thinking of like how the melodies sound. To me, it's like it's not as musically complicated to come up with those melodies, but there's a gift, the ability to make those melodies that people hum, that I don't think you can't reproduce that.
I would say if you take like Chapel Roan's melodies, which I think are pretty inventive. I mean, they're not incredibly avant-garde or something, and you put them up against like the just completely non-memorable later U2. Like It's a Beautiful
Yeah.
Day, like that song melodically, there's just nothing there.
I agree.
There's no kind of melodic motion.
There's still
But I
some of the
actually,
sound, like you can hear that's the Edge's guitar, and that's nice. And I like the way Bono sings. So you're listening to U2, and that's pleasant in a sort of way. It's got the ambiance of U2. But you're right, that's not comparable to the earlier, like
yeah.
fresher stuff that they're doing. Although they're not, I don't think they put together phenomenal melodies.
I actually think the
Really-
Smiths comparison is kind of interesting because Johnny Marr also did some very interesting guitar stuff, right?
Mhm.
Whereas
Yeah.
if you listen to a Smith song and you can hear it when Morrissey goes solo, now all of a sudden his backing band just sounds like a normal,
Mhm.
rock and roll backing track with just kind of like rhythm guitar, occasional lead guitar.
And I
But
I guarantee that's not a mistake. He doesn't want anybody in the room that's gonna
Yeah, he doesn't want another Johnny
compete with him.
Marr
Yeah,
kind of
no,
like.
exactly.
But I
So-
think it was a similar competition. Like if you listen to, and I think Johnny Marr's riffs were very unique. I don't think anyone was doing anything like
No,
that.
it's hard to
Yeah.
find anything that sounds like the way Hand in Glove or This Charming
Oh
Man
yeah,
he plays
oh
on
yeah.
it. I don't know what else sounds like that from before that.
Yeah.
But I should probably do a Smiths episode at some point.
But it's very
Yeah.
similar. It's like you take out Morrissey's vocal, and I think they irritated the hell out of each other in the same way. And I mean, talk about like kind of annoying. Like Morrissey can be quite.
Sometimes whatever you're doing, you have to involve yourself with people that challenge you, right? And are to some degree understand you. That's a way to grow.
Well, it's probably a lesson for life, honestly. Like as we get older, it's probably tempting to surround ourselves with people who are more like us
Mm-hmm.
than we did when we were like. I feel like my group of friends was very diverse when I was a little kid. And then as you get older, it starts to be like I remember like we were in college. I remember noticing like it was the first time I'd ever hung out with a group where everybody was white. And I was like, this is weird. How did that happen? That just kind of happened overnight. Like,
That is true. Yeah.
it wasn't like that in high school, and it certainly wasn't like that before. But we usually do a thing called the biggest surprise, and I cannot imagine anything surprised you. Maybe it's been a while since you went back and listened to this, Steve. I don't know. Did anything?
Here, I got
surprise
something
you?
that surprised me, Dave. Up until we graduated high school, the reason I discovered Van Halen is they were just played on the radio constantly.
Think
I
about this
can't
really-
understand how you missed, like you listened to DC 101, right?
Uh-huh.
It was like constant on the radio when we were in middle school, high school.
I didn't listen to DC 101. I listened to Q107 and
Yeah.
into HFS. I got into as Q107
Okay.
went off the air. I started listening exclusively to HFS. I don't think I picked up DC 101 until much later.
Yeah. Van Halen's probably a little before our generation, but on the other hand, the two biggest bands with the most number one like radio hits were Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers and Van Halen throughout the 80s and 90s.
I knew about Van Halen because of Beat It, actually, and I was a big fan of Michael Jackson when I was a little kid, and that's really helped up over the years. I'm glad about that. But my first tape that I bought was Slippery When Wet.
Yeah.
That's where I start listening to rock and roll is 1987. That's like before that I heard it, I was aware it existed, but for some reason the sound of that band I just sounded cool to me, and I got it.
My first tape was Appetite for Destruction.
Yeah, that's
And
same
I
thing.
don't want to brag, but I got it along with 5 other tapes for only 1 penny. It was a secret deal I had.
Yeah, but now are they still sending you tapes today? Are you still getting cassette tapes?
Yeah, and they're pretty exorbitant. Actually, it's really been
$900.
really
My
been.
first tapes were Genesis, Land of Confusion, Huey Lewis and the News Sports, and then my neighbor had Van Halen 1984, and I taped it from him on the dual cassette. You can copy it.
I mean, it sounds like you just got into getting music and purchasing music before I did.
Maybe.
When I was a little kid,
And I hope the FBI isn't listening to this. Steve just admitted to pirating a copyrighted album on a dual tape deck thing. It's really.
I actually remember doing that with Bon Jovi. I remember taping it, using a tape recorder and holding it next to my clock radio so that I'd have this grainy version of Living on a Prayer, like, because I just really wanted to hear it. But I would just catch songs on the radio sometimes. I really was sort of completely unaware of how to find music or what to buy or anything like that.
Well, I never did that. Any music I listened to, I purchased legally.
You
And
already
it's like,
admitted
I think
LimeWire. You know what LimeWire is, and you said that earlier.
I read it on some website about what not to do. But I was actually thinking about this the other day. Is we're kind of spoiled with the internet. You know, YouTube will suggest things, Pandora will suggest things, Spotify, any music service. You can read blogs and instantly look up the music they're talking about.
Yeah.
I don't know how people, because I remember as a kid, I listened to Joe Satriani, the guitar guy, and literally the way I found out about him is I was in a Tower Records and I was like, what is this playing? And they're like, oh, it's Joe Satriani. It was like, I'll take one. It was just like,
there was something,
you really had no way of finding out about it. It was crazy.
It's like a lot of things with the internet. There's something lost and there's something gained, right? Because you really had to work to get your music. Like discovering a song, the pleasure of figuring out what that song was and getting it is gone today. You know, you hear a song, I Shazam it while I'm in a bar and I'm like, oh, cool. And then I just play it on Spotify.
I have a friend who's in a band here. They've played kind of quite a bit, and I don't know if they're still putting out things. Actually, his drummer is now the Flaming Lips drummer. Cool. But so he has like, you know, his band's songs on Spotify and you can see all these metrics. And he was telling me that like, you know, 99% of listeners listen to something like the first, it's like 15, I don't know the actual number, but it's like 15 seconds, 20 seconds of a song, maybe even less. I mean, that's such a luxury to be able, because I remember when you were a kid, you would like buy a CD and you'd be like,
know what was on it.
I hope I like these 10, like at least, you know, 5 of these 10 songs. Otherwise, this is a total waste. I did that with David Bowie's Space Oddity, like the album, and the only good song on there is Space Oddity. And I was like, well.
Like I used to get an album and it would be like, you know, it's an investment when you're a kid, right? It's a lot of money. It's like, so you buy a CD for $15 and you're not buying 10 CDs that week. You get one CD and you listen to it for days and days. I remember I got the Alanis, that first Alanis Morissette album, because I really liked You Ought to Know. I was like, that's a cool song. And I had this expectation that the whole album was going to be like that. And I started playing it and it was all like just mopey girl acoustic rock stuff. And I was like, this is not at all what I thought this album was. And then because it was, you had invested so much, we actually listened to that album playing Super Metroid for a couple of days straight. And eventually after the 4th or 5th time listening to it, I'm like, well, actually kind of like this mopey girl acoustic. This is an okay album. But today I would never give that a second listen. I would just toss it. I'd be like, this sucks. Just move on to something else, you know? Yeah. And not to mention, I would just listen to the one song I liked and never think about getting a whole album.
You know, I
well,
like
the whole idea of an album now doesn't even make any sense, right?
It's just atavistic. I mean, the only reason it exists is because there used to be albums.
Dave, I like riding bikes, and they had this super cheap deal at Walmart on this.
For a second, I thought you'd had brain damage and you reverted to being 4. And you're just like, Dave, I like riding bikes.
Well, we were talking about how you discover music when you were a little kid.
Let's eat pizza.
Like, but you're talking about investing in something, right? You've bought something and you have to use it. Or you buy like a bunch of lunch meat and you're like, there's that little bit left and it's like a couple days past expired and you're like,
I bought a bike recently and I'm literally, every time I ride it, I'm like, okay, now I only paid $25 for each ride on this bike. And then I ride it again. I'm like $20 and it's getting better every time I ride this piece of crap bike that I should have thrown away.
I returned the bike was the story because it's just like, I couldn't take it.
What about all the old lunch meat? What happened to that? You didn't eat that, did you?
So, Jay, did anything surprise you?
Actually, I think kind of what I talked about earlier is how effortless the album sounds. It really sounds like it could be, you know, and I think that's something that good artists are really able to do. Like I've been on this kick recently of Kate Bush, you know, the British singer-songwriter. And a lot of her earlier albums, it really sounds like she just goes into the studio and she's like, I'm going to sing a song. And she sings this absolutely gorgeous song. But, you know, it's a weird thing that we have with art where, and I even notice it with like students, where when students are trying to learn how to do math, they kind of think that the way the textbooks are written are what people wrote down, just kind of sitting at the table. And they're like, I'm going to write a textbook. And they and they don't see all the editing and all the work that goes behind the scenes with it. And I think that's kind of a sign that something is well put together. If you the more that it hides kind of the work that goes into it. And in the same way, like you read someone like Ernest Hemingway, it really seems like you're reading the first draft of whatever. But so in that same way, the album, it really, you know, it's hard to imagine them writing a song, editing it, going back, changing something. It just seems like it's very organic.
Yeah. In fact, we did a podcast episode on the road, and that is expressly, when you read On the Road, you're like, it's supposed to be stream of consciousness. It's supposed to be the first draft. It is totally not the first draft.
Oh,
Labored over it intensely. It changed everything many, many times. And I would have never known that except by learning about the process by which the book was written. So,
well, I think this goes back to like 10,000 hours, right? Like this is a band that they were very precise. But then once they got to the studio, it was almost like you trained, so that when you got to the studio, then it came out as effortless.
Yep.
But I mean, in terms of the songwriting, like there's no way they wrote those songs in like one session, because the songs are really
right.
They're well crafted, but
Yeah.
they sound just kind of natural. Like each part kind of sounds kind of the natural direction of the song.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It's natural, not because you played it the first time, but because you've played it 100 times, and now you can just do it easily. Right, it's practice, right?
Well, it's almost like muscle memory, right? We've played the song a million times, so we know how to play it. Yeah, I thought the band sounded super confident, and so I wasn't surprised when I saw they'd been playing together for like 14 years by the time this album comes out. Yeah. The closest thing I would say to a biggest surprise is honestly, I didn't know they went back as far as 1978. I thought that was pretty surprising. I was like, oh wow, like I think of them as an 80s band, 100%. Although if I thought about it, I would know, yeah, they were around in the early 80s. They probably went back. But that's like the same year, the Sex Pistols hit in 77. Mm-hmm. I think The Cure got together in 1978. I think the U2 also gets together. The Police is about the same time. There's like a wave of bands that we think of as kind of being 80s bands, but they got together.
There's an amazing thing when you can kind of see a new kind of era or a new kind of genre being ushered in. Yeah. And I was remembering, I watched a concert of Black Sabbath in Paris in 1969. So this is the same year as the White Album, and they're doing like War Pigs, and it's like this is just so completely different.
Right.
Yeah.
And
we were saying that about Tommy when we were doing the shows. It's 1969. They played that at Woodstock. That blew my mind. I'm like, this was already around? I mean, I knew the Who went back to the mid-60s, but Tommy, to me, is a creation of the 1970s in my mind. Yeah. It really didn't seem like the right place. I think that a lot of the bands I was just listing that sort of spawned in the late 70s, I really think that either the Sex Pistols represented a sea change that was going to happen in rock, or they initiated it. I think people got excited about music again in about 1977.
Well, a lot of times I'm kind of sensitive to things like that, because I remember my mom telling me about when they got the record for Sgt. Pepper, and they expected it was going to be more, because even though like Revolver and Rubber Soul have some pretty kind of interesting songwriting,
you can see it coming on those.
But they're nowhere near as close as Sgt. Pepper.
The guys in the Beatles, were they born before World War II or after, or during?
Like immediately after. Well, no, wait a minute. No. I think you're right. I think Paul McCartney's 1941.
Yeah.
Yeah, 41, I would say.
Sting has a song called Born in the 50s, right? Mm-hmm. So what you're dealing with here is like the people that were born of the parents of the World War II, right? The Van Halen's dad was conscripted to play in marching bands by the Nazis, living in Holland and that area, left Holland after World War II. David Lee Roth's dad, I think, was a fighter pilot in World War II, GI Bill, then became a doctor based on GI Bill. But all these bands in the late 70s, they were like the first post-World War II people. They were born after the war.
So I think we did our biggest surprises. And I think we need to come to the point in the evening where we go ahead and vote. And usually what we do is the person that picked the thing recuses themselves. But when we have 3, we have a natural break to the deadlock. So why don't we all just have a full vote on whether this is the classic and whether we're going to toast it? Let's go with Jay as the first vote.
Okay, I'll definitely vote that it's a classic.
You're toasting this classic. Do you want to give closing arguments for why you're to try to persuade Steve? You got to try to persuade Steve because he's on the fence about this album. So
yeah, I'm not sure how Steve is going to vote. So I really how do I persuade him? There's something in the music also that even though it's very effortless, there's also an excess, and I feel like that's very kind of endemic to the 80s in the way that like certain things are really a product of their time. Like Steve kept mentioning like big band music. If you heard like kind of a big band clarinet or something like that, you'd be like, oh, clearly this is 20s, 30s, something like that. They really just exemplified that period in music, and it's just such a change from stuff before it that I think it's almost like just a historical thing. I think the songs are really good. I think the guitar playing is awesome, but I think just as a historical thing, like if you were a historian studying that era, you would definitely look at.
And that is something that we talk about when we're talking about, is this a classic? Is it influential? Is it emblematic of the era? And I think it's pretty clearly those things, even if you don't like it.
I still I like it though. But
No, you're saying it. Yeah, no, I'm just saying even if you didn't,
Yeah.
you'd be like, this needs to be in the canonical works of the late 70s, early 80s, because you can't tell the story without it. To me, the sound is of the 80s, right? Obviously, this is from 1978, but this is an 80s sound. And there's something that's shared by 80s bands, like you said, like Guns N' Roses. Pretty clearly an 80s band. Late 80s, it's different. But what is shared between those two? Like, what's the commonality that sort of links together that era? Like, what?
I think it's an expressiveness, right? It's a celebration. It's in the 70s, it was more like your hands in your pockets, and we're going to.
They're having fun. They're having fun.
They're having fun, and it's going back to that earlier era, I think.
And that's maybe what distinguishes the early 90s stuff. Stone Temple Pilots, Pearl Jam, Nirvana. They're not having fun anymore.
They're going back to the 70s.
They're going back to the 70s. Yeah.
Well, I mean, Nirvana, when Nirvana first came out and kind of grunge, and I mean, it's really weird to think of Smells Like Teen Spirit, playing on MTV at the same time as like, Warrant and all these like hair bands that have a completely different view. And like, so for a while, like in the early 2000s, I thought it was very strange that you have all this new metal stuff and like, like Korn or like, and so the thing is that you have to say how miserable you are in those things. And then you have hip hop and you have to say like how extremely
awesome
like
wealthy.
Yeah, how wealthy you are, right? And it's such a weird split that there's this kind of prerequisite to be able to speak in this genre of music.
Also,
and I think part of that was a backlash against like the glam metal of the glam metal of the 80s and stuff that was ushered in the same way. Here's another kind of parallel. I think Pearl Jam is a very good band. The stuff they ushered in, there was a lot of horrible stuff that came from people copying Pearl Jam. And I'd say the same thing about Van Halen. Van Halen kind of ushers in glam metal. And there's a lot of really bad bands that got very famous because record companies are like, we did great with Van Halen. What else can we put out there?
Yep. Well, I think something like Warrant is a good example, or Tesla or something like that. Like the stuff that was around right before Nirvana was the asteroid that killed them all off in about 1991,
Yeah.
Which honestly, I didn't hate those bands. I listened to those songs on the radio. But when Nirvana happened, I was like, thank you. This is better. I'd much rather listen to this for a couple of years. I'm going to enjoy this. We did that on a whole Nirvana Nevermind podcast episode that we did, I don't know, a year ago.
I think it's like when you have a genre that goes too far in one direction or too far in the other, then there's something that would pulls it back to recenters it, right? Like even this album here, Jay, you mentioned Little Dreamer. Little Dreamer is voted least likely to succeed. There's minor chords in it. It's not necessarily like bop bada shooby doo wah, like expressive, like we're dancing. Like,
I heard that was David Lee Roth's favorite city to play in.
Yeah, what is?
Bop bada shoo wah boo wah, wasn't it?
That's I'm the One. That's a complete dichotomy, complete different songs in this album. There's diversity, right? It's not like hands in your pockets looking at the ground.
I think I'm going ahead and I'm going to vote. I mean, I think I already gave myself away with pretty much just chiming in and agreeing with everything Jay said. Steve, you're the Van Halen guy. Since it's already been voted as a classic, let's throw a little wrinkle your way. Is this the album that should be the classic? If the asteroid's coming and we can only save one Van Halen album, is this the one?
Oh yeah, of the Van Halen albums for sure.
Really?
We didn't even get to Eruption, the guitar solo, right? So
that was actually pretty. I actually did dig that.
Yeah, but the producer, and this is pretty well documented, mentions that was never intended to be in the album. They're closing up the studio. Their rental time's about to run out. And he hears Eddie Van Halen doing his warm-up, and he's like, what is that? And the guy that's the sound engineer goes, what the heck is that? And then they get it on the album literally in the last hour they had of recording in the studio, which is expensive. At this point, whether it's Rolling Stone or whatever, that's ubiquitous, is like, oh, greatest rock guitar solo of all time. Whether it is, that's your own, opinion, right? But it's definitely like monumental. It's definitive. It's, influential, super influential, right?
Speaking of how influential it is, I think Bob had a friend who, like, he was like showing Bob how he played guitar and he could play Eruption. Mm-hmm. And Bob was like, oh, that's really cool. You can play Eruption. And the guy was like, I was born in California in the 80s. Everyone could play Eruption. Like everyone played it. It was like everywhere.
We'll occasionally get together with my neighbors and we'll play guitar. My friend plays bongos or whatever. And like, I never try to solo. Like I love Van Halen, but like I'll just strum a few chords. I like to sing a little bit, but like I do the farthest thing from that because it's just I don't know if it's just that I hear that and I love it, but I'm just like I can't really do it right. So I'm not going to even try it.
I don't play
Yeah.
any lead guitar at all.
Yeah.
To me, it's a completely different thing. I just can't even. I don't even understand how it works. But
it's just I know it's just like anything. Like I'm an architect, and I know that I've done this for 20 years, and I feel like comfortable and it's effortless, and I can thumb through the code book, and I can look at people and be like, no, you would never want to do that.
It sounds like we are certifying Van Halen's 1978 album, Van Halen #1. Did not have the #1 because I don't think they knew whether there'd be any more albums, right? They were worried. They didn't want to seem cocky. We are certifying this one as a classic. We're toasting Van Halen's 1978 album, Van Halen #1. Steve Kattula and Jay Schweig, thanks for joining me, gentlemen. This has been a lot of fun. Signing off for Toasting the Classics. Peace out, everybody.
All right.
Thank
Thanks.
you.